how does this get resolved, this indebtedness? Because, as you say, productivity is dwindling and the government is giving out the candy. And it just seems harder and harder to get elected in a democracy to deal with this problem.
Yeah. So I'll give you one very speculative scenario as to how it gets resolved in a second. But I think until it gets resolved, what is going to happen is that debt, a bit like climate damage, becomes part of our lives. And when globalization got going, that was the time when the euro was being formed. We were all told about the Maastricht criteria. You can't have debt to GDP above 60% or else. And we had the Asian crisis when, debt levels were actually not that big at the time. The US had debt to GDP of 40%. So in a way, you and I are conditioned to think that, if a country passes its, let's say 80, 90%, then we should instinctively
Yes.
expect a crisis. And the fact that hasn't happened, to me, suggests that the world economy and the financial system is sort of evolving around these debt loads. So we have the rise of the private credit market. We have enormous numbers of fintechs in London who are doing buy now, pay later. So that keeps it going and maybe stores up the risks for later. And I think until we get to later, debt will change politics in a number of important ways. It will severely diminish fiscal space. So governments won't really be able to do very much to, in a Keynesian way, stimulate the economy. That's been the case in France for a long time. It'd probably be the case early on, I think, for Labour. And what that does then for politicians, it pushes them to fight another terrain, probably on the issues of identity, value, immigration. Again, France is probably the example. I think the UK is interesting in that the Labour government will probably introduce a level of boring calm to policy making, which I think would be good for the economy. It's already very clear that the promises that they were making maybe a year ago on green energy spending can't be met by the government balance sheet. So I think what we will see governments and really big investors, be it sovereign wealth funds, the big pension funds in the US and Canada, do a lot of this stuff together. And I think that's kind of the plan for GB Energy, is that they try and act as a focal point for some of these international investors. So that's kind of how we get by with all this debt load in the interim, and I don't think there's any magic solution to that. Then the textbook solutions are inflation. Growth is obviously my favorite one, which I think is why productivity is so important. Education, rule of law, all that sort of stuff needs to be rediscovered by Western governments. And then we come potentially to an end game. So if we go back to the first period of globalization, ended in 1912, you had the accumulation of financial risks, you had the First World War, and then afterwards, part of that in 1924, so exactly 100 years ago in London, you had the Dawes Conference, when Germany went to Britain and France and said, guys, we have too much debt. Can you forgive us some of that debt? And they said yes. And then they went to America and said, can you forgive us some of our debt? So you had this debt conference. And my very, very speculative idea is that we may end up in another world debt conference. And I think it could happen somewhere with a good bar like the Raffles Hotel in Singapore, because it's sort of it's a geopolitical midpoint between the US and China, where the great powers get together and this kind of carving up of debt and repackaging of debt, etc. Because it's very hard to see how all of the big economies can reduce debt at the same time. And the final point to make is that in financial markets, when everyone does something at the same time, that can produce a brilliant trade or trend, as the US banks were doing in the 2000s in the housing market, the mortgage market. But the fact that they're all doing the same thing, eventually just that it accumulates that risk and it makes an end solution a lot more dramatic.
Are you saying we're in the phase now when everyone's doing the same thing, or are you saying that might come after this debt conference?
We are in the phase now where everyone is doing the same thing. China will accumulate more debt because it's absorbing more private debt. The US, it seems, is in a mindset to increase its debt and not to cut its fiscal deficit. And I think if Trump is the next president, that will become even more difficult.
Yeah.
I think in Europe, Britain and France are probably at the limit of their debt and will be constrained in what they can do. And then Japan is just heavily indebted. So we're still, I think, at the margin accumulating debt across the nations of the world. And that will go. I think that will go on until there is some crisis, and I suspect that crisis will come with a flaw in one of these magic solutions. So one of the magic solutions that central banks just suppress and hoover up this debt, and that could be Japan. You just get this, terrible move in the yen, and then people begin to price in balance sheet risk to other currencies. That's just a very speculative kind of scenario. I don't think we're there yet. We'll probably need to be provoked by another leg higher in inflation, maybe.